Hi, everybody. I'm Srdjan Lemez, and I'm an assistant professor at Cal Poly Pomona, which is located in Southern California. And today I wanted to discuss a relatively new area of research for me, which is exploring the transition out of sport for professional athletes. Now, I'm sure many of you who are listening to this asynchronous presentation who have played sports growing up, that there was a time where part of your self-identity had to do with you being an active athlete. And if we started playing at a young age, there is a lot of identity development and confusion as it is in those formative years. Consequently, what researchers have identified is that those who have a long and robust athletic identity tend to actually struggle the most psychosocially when it comes to career termination. Naturally, the transition process can blur our sense of self, and there appears to be a very clear vacuum left behind when we do end up retiring from sport. Now, what's exciting is that research attention has been steadily growing over the past 3 decades in this area, where now researchers have identified robust predictors that influence the quality of an athlete's transition. And these predictors generally fall into the 4 major sets of categories that you see before you. And this relates to the 1981 Schlossberg transition theory, where things related to ourself, the context, the social support system, and our coping response will influence the quality of our transition into that next chapter of our lives. Now, while some athletes may successfully adapt to this next chapter, others suffer from things like distress, maladjustment, and negative emotions, including identity loss, depression, and anxiety. And as a result, researchers now overwhelmingly believe that we need to consider the concept of retirement as a process rather than a single event. And in sports psychology literature, psychological notions of identity and choice are particularly important in the well-being outcomes of our athletes. While there are several components of self-identity that are important to explore when we're looking at the transition process out of sport for athletes, whether that includes social identity or self-concept or even self-esteem, it is important that we take a broader step back and we look at the model of transition more holistically. So we develop a more complete understanding of the various predictors that influence the quality of our transition. Now, given the high rates of participation in sport globally, and particularly organized youth football here in America, and the rising recognition among the general population of the various health benefits of sport and exercise, we actually surprisingly know very little about promoting and implementing successful end-of-career transitions in our athletes. As such, the broader significance of this proposed project is really to update our understanding of the robust predictors associated with healthy and unhealthy adjustment to the discontinuation from sport. More specifically, the overarching purpose of this proposed study is to examine this transition out of sport process through a biopsychosocial lens in a former National Football League player. And the biopsychosocial model is that holistic model that I just mentioned, where we look at it from a physical, a social, and a psychological standpoint. Recruitment of the former NFL player will be done through a convenience sampling technique because he is a former neighbor of mine whom I've kept in touch with. And using a narrative qualitative study design, a series of open-ended interviews over the course of several weeks will be conducted this summer related to him transitioning out of professional sport. The biopsychosocial model, as mentioned previously, will be the model that guides these interview questions because it does help us frame the discussion more holistically so we understand the quality of his transition from multiple angles. And interviews will be conducted either in person, through Zoom, or a mix of both, and they will be audio recorded. And en vivo software data analysis will be used to transcribe the interviews along with thematically coding the interviews as well. While this is a qualitative study design and therefore there isn't a hypothesis, I did want to briefly talk about some thematic results that could be anticipated that are based in findings from previous studies that have been published in this area. Now, it is very likely that the themes that we spoke about earlier that you see here are going to be the same themes that emerge from my interviews with the former NFL player. Starting with the self, one of the most important and common themes that has emerged from this literature is that although promoting an athletic identity is obviously beneficial for a developing athlete who's very serious about their craft, it can also turn into a detriment in retirement. So an athletic identity is one where you identify in your athletic role. And if you have a really strong and exclusive athletic identity, that's great in development. However, that actually can turn into a barrier during that transition process that affects the quality of that athlete's transition. And this is also called identity foreclosure. For example, research on gymnastics has found that those who have been encouraged to dedicate their lives to gymnastics end up adopting this identity that's based solely on their role as being a gymnast, which leaves them lost and helpless when they end up going into that next chapter of their lives. And this was similarly found in other sports, for example, women's golf, where they end up prioritizing golf over other developmental and social activities, which ends up foreclosing other aspects of their lives. Endorsement of an exclusive athletic identity and having that really narrow self-concept has been shown to significantly predict anxiety symptoms and psychiatric distress in post-retirement, especially where there is that really strong correlational relationship between having that strong and exclusive athletic identity and the degree in which emotional adjustment is required. Athletic career retirement is far different from occupational retirement for a number of reasons, namely the age in which you retire. Professional athletes tend to retire at a much younger age in comparison to workers from the general population. For example, the average age of retirement for an NFL player is only 27. So it's no surprise that a theme that's likely going to emerge from my interviews with this participant is that he's going to end up describing himself in terms of his vocation since retiring from the NFL. What might be even more surprising is the link between your self-identity post-retirement and your employment choice. Researchers in 2018 found that the current occupation of over 97% of retired football players in their sample was actually football related. And anecdotally speaking, I'm already aware that the participant that I will be interviewing is involved with coaching collegiate football. And of course, this all relates back to their self-identity in that athletes who end up prioritizing their athletic identity above other domains of the self typically experience lower global self-esteem and lower self-efficacy in relation to career decision-making, where they are more likely to stick with what they know. Voluntary versus involuntary athlete retirement is one of the most important factors to consider during this transition process. And the decision to retire voluntarily often gives the athlete that subjective feeling of control where they tend to be less resistant and more psychologically prepared than an athlete who got forced out. So when I say voluntary, what I mean by that is that the athlete is leaving the sport by free choice. They have an opportunity to pre-plan their transition. They established identities outside of sport, and they developed very healthy coping skills. Now, the problem is that we don't live in a utopia, and as a result, a lot of athletes don't retire voluntarily because they don't have an opportunity to do so. And that leads to something called a crisis transition. As mentioned before, choice is particularly important when it comes to the well-being outcome of retiring athletes. And the last theme that I want to explore here is the influence of social support. Identity foreclosure is strongly correlated with who we surround ourselves with. And researchers have found that cultivating a network of individuals and resources really does help former athletes to renegotiate their identities more successfully. And while we already know the ubiquitous psychological benefits of surrounding ourselves with a really good support system, especially given the socio-emotional threat that retirement can bring, what researchers have found, which is quite interesting, is that providing support to others rather than actually getting their support tends to be equally, if not more effective at us successfully adapting in retirement. So this finding has been substantiated by a lot of other research that suggests that the act of giving can really foster a sense of making a positive contribution to someone's life, and therefore it can enhance our own personal positive self-regard. Although I won't be conducting this study until the summer, there are some future considerations that I've come across that I'd like to share. Beginning with the methods, we know the importance of personal and demographic variables on our outlook on life. Surprisingly, this really hasn't been examined too much in this area of research. For example, the relationship between current health status and self-identity hasn't been looked at former athletes. And we know the importance of looking at current health status in former athletes, especially those who played contact-based sports like football. The other thing that struck me is a disproportionate amount of cross-sectional retrospective study designs in comparison to longitudinal prospective research designs. And we know that retirement is a process rather than a single event, and therefore the interviews that I do conduct with my participant this summer might be the first of several in which I follow him longitudinally to see how his retirement evolves. Now, from an applied perspective, it's important to ask this question: how do we build psychological flexibility in our athletes? And two main ways have been suggested: early interventions, where we focus on multiple identity development for increased life satisfaction later in life. And then secondly, the importance of promoting dual careers, where we're developing skills outside of sport that gives us an opportunity to work in within the general population after retirement, and we don't feel like that exclusive athletic identity is preventing us from doing so. Active and former athletes may find particular interest in looking at potential pitfalls to consider when pursuing competitive athletics, and that includes identity formation and development. When we say the word transition, what we should be saying is adaptation, but adaptation to life after sport is often complex and multifaceted. Therefore, developing a biopsychosocial understanding of that transition process is all the more important. And finally, there may be value at looking at other life transitions as we move towards a better understanding of athlete transitions, particularly given the extra layer of uncertainty that today's athletes face given the COVID-19 global pandemic. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and thank you to the conference organizing committee as well.